Welcome everybody. Today I'm going to share my drawings and my lesson learned from the book of James in the Bible. James is one of my favorite books in the Bible because it inspires me to put my faith into action. When I read through James, it reminds me to stay faithful and work hard at being a good steward. The two chapters I want to refer to today is James chapter 2 verses 14 through 26 called Faith and Deeds, and the other is James chapter 3 verses 1 through 12 called Taming the Tongue. I'm not planning to read all of these 24 verses in the video, but I would recommend them to anyone. To keep this video brief, I'm planning to share my story and how these two chapters have helped me. Chapter 2 talks about how faith is dead without works. I don't believe James is at odds with the Apostle Paul's message here when he said we are saved by grace. What I believe James is saying here is if we have faith, we must show it by helping people. In the next section, it provides a great example of how we can put our faith into action by taming our tongue. What I believe James is saying is if we praise God, we must not curse others because they are made from God's likeness. These two chapters in James have challenged and reminded me I must be kind with my words. I have really learned this from close relationships where I'm not as careful in what I say. This is not as easy as I must continue to pray for God's help in practicing this lifetime discipline. As part of creating this video, I enjoy drawing and sharing what inspires me about the passage. What I was most curious about this book is the author so I could learn from James' perspective. I learned that there are actually 3 James in the New Testament. The first is James, son of Zebedee, or James the Greater. Most scholars believe that James the Greater did not write this epistle. Next we have James, son of Alphaeus, or James the Less. Some also believe that this James did not write the book either. Then we have a third James, brother of Jesus, or James the Just. Some believe that he was the author. And then one last possibility is the last 2 James I mentioned are the same person who wrote this book. Since it wasn't clear to me on the exact author, I decided to start by looking for images of James, brother of the Lord, as inspiration. It turned out there are not a lot of these images of James, brother of the Lord, so I decided to also reference James, son of Alphaeus, for additional inspiration. Here's a process I will use to create my drawings of James. I'll start by drawing a picture from reference, then I will create the next from memory and make changes with my imagination. In order to improve, I repeat these steps a couple of times, and I spend an hour on each drawing to give me a consistent results. So let's take a look at my progress. Here's my first drawing from reference. Even though I was using a reference, I wanted to make it a little bit of my own by creating my own interpretations. The right hand is not exactly what I had in mind, so I made the fingers a little more realistic in my opinion. I also made changes to the beard as I didn't think the references looked quite right. Let's move on to my first drawing without a reference. It kept a lot of the same features as the reference, other than the sash didn't quite turn out the same. The most difficult part are usually the hands and the face. The face is a little bit wider in this one, but I believe it still turned out okay. Now let's take a look at my second reference. The drawing turned out to be very similar. I had extra time to spend, so I decided to paint this one. I didn't have a lot of time though because I could have spent more time detailing the color. The sash could have been darker and I missed around some of the edges. Moving on to my second painting without a reference. I used similar color scheme from my last references. The face and the hands started to look a little more unique in my own style. And these features are more round and less long and skinny. The robe could have used more detail to look more natural in the way that it lays across his torso. I believe this version is improved from my last version. At least my daughter told me she thought it did. I'm now sharing my third version from reference. I've started to catch my mistakes much earlier now. This time I worked on taking less time to draw and more time to paint within the hour. I spent about half of my time drawing and the other half painting. I tried a different color technique by painting each color a new layer and overlapping the boundaries to provide a consistent shading. Then I came back and erased the overlapping color with a fine tip brush. Overall, I'm pleased with the improvements of this painting from my previous versions. Here's my last painting without a reference. I used all of the techniques I learned from my first attempts and applied it to this painting. I did a good job pacing myself to make sure I spent enough time in each area, then giving myself enough time to paint. I used the same painting techniques as I did with the reference. I was able to complete this technique by using less layers. I tried to keep my layers to a minimum because the more I used, the more difficult it would be to touch up later on. As I spent the last couple of weeks creating this video and painting, I continued to be reminded the importance of the lessons from James. This project reminded me to put aside my own wants and stay focused on God and helping people. When I'm thinking about God and other people instead of myself, it's much easier to tame my tongue. This video was fun to create, and thank you for being a part of the journey. Don't forget to leave any comments or suggestions, and I hope to see you in the next video. God bless.